scary Peppa Pig episode that never made it on TV. The familiar laughter of Peppa Pig and her family echoed through the house, but a subtle chill had begun to creep into their cozy home. It started with the shadows, stretching longer and darker than usual, twisting into unsettling shapes in the corners of their eyes. Peppa noticed it first, a fleeting glimpse of something in the hallway, a figure that wasn't quite Daddy Pig, its silhouette too tall, too gaunt. She blinked, and it was gone, replaced by the comforting, if slightly snoring, form of her father. George, usually so boisterous, became unusually quiet, his eyes wide as he stared at seemingly empty spaces. Mummy Pig dismissed it as childish imagination, but even she felt a prickle of unease when the teacups rattled on their own, or when a faint, mournful whisper seemed to drift from the attic. One evening, as the family gathered for dinner, the lights flickered, plunging the room into near darkness. When they came back on, the vibrant colors of their home seemed muted, drained. The food on their plates, usually so appealing, now looked strangely unappetizing, almost gray. Daddy Pig, attempting to lighten the mood, told a silly joke, but his laughter sounded hollow, and a cold draft swept through the room, despite all windows being closed. Peppa and George huddled closer, their small hands clutching each other. The air grew heavy, thick with an unspoken presence. A faint scratching sound began, coming from within the walls, a rhythmic, insistent scrape that grew louder with each passing second. It wasn't the sound of mice. It was something larger, something with purpose. The scratching intensified, moving from the living room to the kitchen, then up the stairs. The family froze, their eyes darting nervously. Suddenly, scary Peppa Pig episode that never made it on TV. It was a perfectly ordinary Tuesday morning when Peppa and George woke up in their bedroom. The sun was shining through the curtains, and everything seemed normal. But something felt different today. As they went downstairs for breakfast, Mummy Pig was standing completely still in the kitchen, staring at the wall with an unnaturally wide smile. Her eyes seemed to follow them as they moved, but her head never turned. Daddy Pig sat reading his newspaper, but the pages were completely blank. George tugged on Peppa's dress and pointed to his dinosaur toy. The small green creature now had tiny sharp teeth that gleamed in the morning light. Its plastic eyes had turned completely black, and it seemed to be watching them. The family decided to visit Grandpa Pig's farm, but the journey felt endless. The familiar countryside looked wrong somehow. The trees were too tall, their branches reaching down like grasping fingers. When they arrived at the farm, Grandpa Pig was nowhere to be found. His house stood empty, with all the doors and windows wide open. The animals in the farmyard had gathered in a perfect circle, all facing inward, completely motionless. Peppa called out for Grandpa Pig, but her voice echoed back strangely. George began to cry, but no tears came from his eyes. They discovered that all the vegetables in Grandpa Pig's garden had grown into impossible shapes. Carrots twisted into spirals that hurt to look at, and potatoes had sprouted eyes that blinked slowly. The family tried to leave, but their car wouldn't start. The engine made sounds like distant screaming, and the radio played only static. Night began to fall, though it seemed far too early for darkness. The stars appeared in patterns that spelled out words in a script that made their eyes water to read. They decided to spend the night in Grandpa Pig's house, but every room they entered was exactly the same as the last one they had left. In the living room, the television turned on by itself, showing episodes of their own lives, but everything was slightly wrong. The Peppa on the screen turned to look directly at them. George's dinosaur toy began to grow larger, its plastic becoming flesh, its roar becoming real. It spoke in George's voice, but the words were all wrong. As the night wore on, they realized they were not alone in the house. Footsteps could be heard from upstairs, slow and deliberate. The morning never came. The clock in the kitchen ticked backwards, and the windows showed only endless darkness outside. Peppa looked in the mirror and saw her reflection smile back at her, but she wasn't smiling. Finally, they heard Grandpa Pig's voice calling from somewhere in the house, but it was coming from all directions at once. There were 5 chairs around the table instead of 4. The fifth chair was occupied by someone who looked exactly like Peppa, but her eyes were completely black. The other Peppa stood up slowly and walked toward them. She opened her mouth to speak, and when she did, it was with the voices of everyone they had ever known. Scary Peppa Pig episode that never made it on TV. It was a perfectly ordinary morning in Peppa's house, or so it seemed. Peppa woke up in her bedroom, but something felt different. The walls appeared to be breathing slowly, expanding and contracting like living tissue. She rubbed her eyes, thinking it was just her imagination, but the movement continued. Downstairs, Mummy Pig was making breakfast, but her smile seemed too wide, stretching beyond what should be possible. Her eyes never blinked as she stirred the porridge in perfect, mechanical circles. When Peppa entered the kitchen, Mummy Pig's head turned a full 180 degrees to face her, the smile never wavering. George was already at the table, but he wasn't playing with his dinosaur as usual. Instead, he sat perfectly still, staring at his bowl with unnatural intensity. When Peppa looked closer, she noticed that George's reflection in the spoon showed a completely different expression, one of pure terror, silently screaming. Daddy Pig emerged from behind his newspaper, but the pages were blank except for a single sentence repeated over and over. "They are watching you." His glasses reflected not the room around them, but endless corridors that seemed to stretch into darkness. The family decided to visit Grandpa Pig's farm, but the journey felt impossibly long. The same trees passed by the car window again and again, as if they were driving in circles. The radio played the same cheerful tune on repeat, but the melody began to distort, becoming slower and more sinister. At the farm, the animals were all facing the same direction, standing perfectly motionless. Their eyes had turned completely black, and they moved in perfect synchronization when they walked. Grandpa Pig greeted them with his usual warmth, but his shadow moved independently, waving when he was still. In the garden, Peppa found her favorite mud puddle, but the water was darker than usual, almost black. When she looked into it, instead of her own reflection, she saw countless other Peppas looking back, all with slightly different expressions of growing fear. The sky began to change color, shifting from blue to a sickly green, then to deep purple. The sun remained in the same position, but its light grew dimmer and colder. Birds flew in perfect geometric patterns, their songs replaced by an eerie humming. As evening approached, the family returned home, but the house had changed. Rooms led to different places than before, and hallways stretched longer than they should. The stairs creaked with voices whispering names that no one recognized. When bedtime came, Peppa climbed into her bed, but the ceiling above her had become transparent. Through it, she could see infinite layers of identical bedrooms, each with another Peppa lying in bed, all looking up at her. The last thing she heard before everything went dark was the sound of all the other Peppas whispering in unison. "You're not the real one." Scary Peppa Pig episode that never made it on TV. It was a quiet evening at Peppa's house when something very strange began to happen. The family had just finished dinner and were settling down to watch television, but the screen kept flickering with images that shouldn't have been there. At first, it showed normal Peppa Pig episodes, but then the characters started moving differently, their smiles becoming too wide, their eyes growing darker. Peppa noticed it first. She pointed at the television and said something was wrong, but when Mummy and Daddy Pig looked, everything appeared normal to them. The screen showed Peppa and George playing in their garden, but the Peppa on television was doing things the real Peppa hadn't done. She was digging holes in the ground, deeper and deeper, while television George watched with an expression that never changed. As the night grew darker, the television began showing places that didn't exist in their world. There was a playground where the swings moved by themselves, a school where the desks were arranged in perfect circles, and a shop where the shelves were filled with toys that looked exactly like Peppa's family and friends, but their faces were blank. The most disturbing part came when the television showed their own house, but it was different. The walls were the same green color, but they seemed to stretch higher than they should. The furniture was in the wrong places, and there were extra rooms that shouldn't exist. In one of these rooms, there was another family that looked exactly like them, but they never blinked. George started crying when he saw his television counterpart turn to look directly at him through the screen. The television George raised his hand and waved, but real George hadn't waved back. Mummy Pig tried to turn off the television, but the remote wouldn't work. The screen grew brighter and brighter until it filled the entire room with an unnatural light. Then something impossible happened. The television Peppa stepped out of the screen and into their living room. She looked exactly like the real Peppa, but her voice was different when she spoke. She said she had been waiting for them to notice her, and that she had been watching them for a very long time. One by one, more versions of the family emerged from the screen. Each one was slightly different. Some had different colored clothes, others had different expressions that never changed. They filled the living room until there was barely any space left. The television versions began to speak in unison, explaining that they wanted to switch places. They said the original family could live in the television world, where everything was always the same. In return, the television family would live in the real world. As dawn approached, the television began to pull the real family toward the screen. The last thing real Peppa saw before crossing over was her television self waving goodbye, settling into her place in the real world with a smile that would never fade.
Peppa Pig, the toy that followed. It started on the playground. George was playing in the sand when he noticed something strange. Between the swings, under the slide, there was a toy. Old, broken. A small stuffed donkey with one ear torn off and empty eye sockets. It was dusty and a little muddy, but it looked like it had been waiting. "Look, Peppa," George picked it up. "He's sad." "Ew, he's dirty. Don't touch that," said Peppa. Someone probably threw it away. But George hugged the toy. "He's lonely." They played a little longer and then went home. George left the donkey on a bench. He didn't even look back. But that evening, when they returned home and went up to their room, the donkey was on his pillow. "George, did you bring it with you?" asked Peppa. "No, I didn't take him. I promise." Mummy Pig picked up the toy and put it in a bag to throw away. Daddy Pig took out the trash before bedtime. But in the morning, it was back on the floor, a little closer to the bed. "Maybe you took it out again, George," Mummy said, trying not to worry. "I didn't touch it," George whispered. "It came on its own." The next night, Peppa woke up to a creaking sound, very faint, like someone walking on the floor. She sat up in bed and saw it. The toy was sitting, no longer lying down, sitting, facing the beds. It looked different. One of its eyes had been replaced with a button. Its smile was slightly stretched, and there was a seam on its neck that hadn't been there before. Peppa walked to the dresser, planning to hide the donkey inside, but then noticed something strange. Footprints, tiny, dirty, leading from the door to their beds. She placed the donkey in a drawer, closed it, checked twice, then hid under the blanket. But in the morning, it was on George's pillow again. "Daddy, it's following us," Peppa cried. "It keeps showing up. It's alive." Daddy Pig took it out again, this time far away, to the bin by the road. He saw it himself. He threw it away. And yet, that very night, after the children fell asleep, the stuffed donkey was sitting in the corner of their room, quietly, head tilted, whispering. The words were impossible to make out, but its lips were moving. Now it stays, a little closer each day, a little louder each night, because it doesn't want to be abandoned. It's found a new friend, and it will never leave.
Scary Peppa Pig episode that never made it on TV. It was a perfectly ordinary Tuesday morning when Peppa and George arrived at their playgroup. The classroom looked exactly as it always did, with purple tables, yellow chairs, and colorful learning posters. But something felt different today. The air seemed thicker, and the usual cheerful chatter was replaced by unsettling silence. Madame Gazelle was standing at the front of the classroom, but her smile seemed wider than usual, stretching unnaturally across her face. Her eyes appeared to be watching everyone at once, never blinking. When she spoke, Her voice had a strange echo that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. The children took their seats as they always did. Peppa sat next to Susie Sheep, while George clutched his dinosaur toy. But as the morning progressed, the toys around the classroom began to move on their own. A teddy bear's head turned slightly. A toy car rolled across a table. During story time, Madame Gazelle opened a book with completely blank pages. Yet she began reading from them as if they contained the most fascinating tale. Her voice grew deeper and more hypnotic with each word, and the children found themselves unable to look away from the empty pages. The classroom windows began to fog up from the inside. Strange shapes appeared in the condensation, handprints too small to belong to any of the children, and words written in an unknown language. The shapes would appear and disappear, always just at the edge of their vision. When it was time for outdoor play, the playground equipment had changed. The slide was now impossibly tall, stretching up into the cloudy sky. The swings moved back and forth on their own, creaking in a rhythm that sounded like a lullaby. The sandbox had turned into a perfect circle of black sand. Peppa and her friends stood at the edge of the playground, unsure whether to venture out. As they hesitated, they noticed that their shadows were moving independently of their bodies. The shadow children were playing different games, making different gestures. The sky above began to darken, though it was still mid-morning. Clouds gathered in unnatural formations, creating shapes that looked like enormous faces peering down at them. Inside the school building, they could hear footsteps in the empty corridors, slow, deliberate steps that echoed through the halls. Madame Gazelle appeared beside them without warning. Her smile was even wider now, and when she spoke, her voice seemed to come from multiple directions. She suggested they play a new game, close their eyes, and count to 100. The children agreed to play this strange game. They closed their eyes tightly and began to count together. But as they counted, they could hear the world around them changing. The sounds of the playground equipment grew louder and more distorted. When they reached 100 and opened their eyes, everything was exactly as it had always been. The slide was its normal height, the swings hung still, and the sandbox contained ordinary golden sand. But as they walked back toward the classroom, Peppa noticed something that made her stomach turn cold. In the sand beneath their feet, she could see footprints that led to places they had never actually walked, arranged in patterns that told the story of a morning that had somehow both happened and not happened at all.
Peppa Pig, the eye collector. It all started with a single button. It was just lying on the kitchen table, black, round, with 4 holes. Mummy Pig picked it up, turned it over in her hoof, and tossed it into the sewing drawer. "Strange," she mumbled. "I don't remember this one." The next day, there were 2, in the exact same place, identical, clean, perfectly smooth, as if freshly made. Mummy Pig put them away again, but couldn't recall where the first had come from. By the 3rd day, there were 4. Daddy Pig decided the children were playing a prank, but Peppa only shook her head. "We didn't touch them. They just appear." On the 4th day, the buttons weren't on the table. They were on the floor, next to Peppa's teddy. "George, look, he used to have eyes. Now they're buttons. Small, shiny, unevenly sewn, but tight." Peppa swore Teddy's eyes used to be glass, blue, cheerful. "Maybe he always looked like that," George said, uncertain. But when she looked in the mirror, she could swear Teddy was watching, following her, unblinking. By the 5th day, buttons were found in the playroom, near the bookshelf, and George's dinosaur, his eyes had changed too. Same black buttons, 4 little holes. "Daddy," Peppa whispered, "someone's replacing them. It's just coincidence," he said, waving it off. But that night, the house fell unnaturally silent. No wind, no drips, no breathing. And then Peppa heard scratching, software uneven, like claws dragging across wallpaper. She stepped into the hallway. On the wall, marks, long, thin, deep, and between them, a phrase carved into the plaster, "Now I see." In the morning, in the family photo frame, all the eyes were buttons, even hers. Only the real Peppa, not yet. It's not us anymore, Mummy Pig whispered. It's changing us. In the closet, they found a box of buttons, but they were too new. No packaging, as if someone had made them. Here, on the seventh night, Peppa saw a shadow in her room, thin, elongated, a vague figure, faceless, shapeless, but with claws, and that same dry scratch. She hid beneath the blanket, but through the fabric she could feel the stare, warm, burning. When she opened her eyes, it was gone. But Teddy had a third eye, right in the middle of his forehead. Daddy Pig no longer looked at Peppa. His eyes were flat, round, black, sewn in. Mummy Pig smiled wider each day, but never spoke again. George cried at night, but didn't know why. And Peppa now carries a mirror, small, round, checks her face every morning, whispers into the glass, still mine, because she knows one day she'll wake up and won't remember what her real eyes ever looked like.